Welcome to In a Nutshell, the podcast dedicated to all things agricultural consulting. I'm Dylan Brush here with soil genius and ag consultant Bill Brush, and we're delighted to accompany you on this journey where we break down the different aspects of agricultural consulting. In each episode, we'll dive into the realm of agriculture through the eyes of Bill Brush, where consultants like Bill play a vital role in empowering farmers, agribusiness, and agricultural organizations. If you're passionate about agriculture, problem solving, and enjoy a little bit of detective work, this podcast is tailor-made for you. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell. Today we're going to be talking about zinc.
Welcome everybody again. Yeah, we're going to talk about zinc today and how necessary it is. This is following up on manganese, which was the previous podcast. But today we're going to talk about zinc, which I think one of the problems I see with zinc is everybody says, yeah, we need zinc, so put it on. And not understanding exactly why sometimes you can actually have an excess of zinc and you don't want to put any more on. But I will talk today about zinc because it is one of those essential micronutrients. And it's one of those that is very, very visible. And I'll explain why you see deficiencies of zinc show up on your plants if you have an insufficient amount. You know, really when you start with the functions. What does zinc do in plants? And one of the things it does is it synthesizes protein, and proteins, just like in livestock, animals, humans, it's essential for muscle and uptake and maintenance of the body. These proteins are essential to the diet. They're essential to the diet of a plant. And the zinc is important, almost essential for the synthesis of these proteins. It also is necessary for the synthesis of a product we call auxin. And auxins, it's really complex. Probably a whole podcast we'll talk about auxins. But trust me that it is an essential piece of plant nutrition, is that manufacturing of those auxins. It's also needed for what we call uniform maturity. And if you've ever seen something severely zinc deficient, you'll see that all of a sudden the new growth is stunted. It just wants to kind of barely just not get out of itself and elongate and grow. So it doesn't uniformly grow. It just sits there. And we call that rosetting, where it's got looks like all of the leaves are coming out of one spot and it just can't get the shoot to take off. And that can be found in a lot of different plants that way. But, we see it a lot in tree crops. We can see it in seeded crops that we put seeds in the ground to germinate and grow. And also, another thing that people don't look at a lot, and this has to do a lot with that symptoms that I'll talk about in a little bit, is it's important for calcium's translocation, to move calcium throughout the plant. Okay, so when you're zinc shortage, one of the things when you talk about cell division, it starts with nitrogen and cell division, taking one cell and making two cells. But then at that point, we need to fill those cells and then glue them together. And that's a function of calcium that I talked about earlier. Okay? Well, not many things, and zinc is the primary one, that basically will move calcium along. Okay? If you do foliars with calcium, one of its downside is you're not moving it throughout the tissue. Wherever you put it, it likes to stay. Translocation means to move it from one place to another. So as shoots are growing, it is moving out that shoot. If you have insufficient zinc, you get the rosetting because you don't have the ability of that plant to actually make more cells and fill those cells and move them along and glue them together. And so because of that, zinc shows up as that way of stunting growth, and it will be smaller than you want it to be. It will not get an overall growth that you're looking for. You'll get things like your leaves will be malformed, they will be twisted, or they'll be bunched up, or they'll be curled in. You'll have what we call interveinal chlorosis, which you see to a certain amount in manganese deficiency, but you also see it definitely in zinc deficiency, which means the veins will be dark green and it'll be yellow between those veins. And the reason is that if you remember, one of my first thing I talked about was uniform maturity. You have enough zinc to get to the veins, but not enough to move nutrients across those veins, between the tissues between those veins, to make them green and give that plant the proper photosynthesis. So we see this interveinal chlorosis. If you're looking at grasses or things that are more just upright leaves, like it could be wintergrains, etc., what you'll see is not necessarily interveinal chlorosis. You'll see stripes going up and down vertically, and that'll give you a good idea of what that looks like. The other thing that you see a lot and people don't really notice it as much is in a tree crop, you'll get twigs that are dying back. You're not getting enough zinc in, and those twigs at the end are dying back because they never got, again, uniform maturity, so that the plant basically says those are malformed, we'll get rid of them, and those twigs die back from the ends back towards the trunk of that tree. Well, what makes it worse? One of the things, and you'll hear this almost throughout all of the micronutrients, is organic soils that are high in organic soil humus or high pHs. Because one of the things that most of these micronutrients like is acid conditions to be released. The problem that most people said, because of that, then I need low acidity to get these in there. I need to get my soil pH down to below 6 so that I can get these micronutrients in. That is good on one side, but bad on this other side, because when you get your low pH, guess what? You lose the uptake of the macronutrients. Nitrogen not as efficient, phosphorus not as efficient, potassium not as efficient, calcium, magnesium not as efficient on these low pH. So what you have to do is create acidity throughout the soil through many different ways, which we talked about a little bit with nitrogen, creating acidity along the rhizosphere, the roots, temporarily and out throughout this plant to be able to pick up these micronutrients. Remember, we don't need a lot of them because they're micronutrients, but we do need to get them into the plant to do all the functions of that. The other thing is, and this is a big reason that a lot of people see zinc deficiency and can't understand it. If you fertilize with high amounts of phosphate, or your soil is high in P and high in phosphorus, one of the things about that is, and this happens a lot on dairy soils through their manure and everything they collect and then spread back on the field has a lot of corn-based products and alfalfa-based products, and those are high in phosphates. So when you start off, you initially are low and you get great responses from these manures, but over time you build up high phosphate, and high phosphate makes it very difficult to take up zinc. So we say it's antagonistic. Phosphate is fighting for uptake in the plants and at the expense of zinc. Conversely, if you have low phosphate and high zinc, you will struggle to pick up adequate phosphate. So they work against each other. So as you're building them up in the soil, as phosphates, if they were low and you're building phosphates up, then you need to correspondingly raise your zinc to match it. And there are numbers that match up with this much phosphate. Say you have 200 pounds in your soil, you need to have 8 parts per million to 9 parts per million of zinc. And as it goes up higher, your zinc needs to go up higher. And you just take them up stair-stepping together, and you'll never have a deficiency on zinc as long as you keep it in balance with the phosphate. So those things are really important to know. So a lot of times they'll say, I put on zinc and I didn't see a response. Well, that's because your phosphate was so high in that soil that it blocked any possibility of that zinc getting into the plant. When you have those conditions, guess what? You're going to have to go around it a little bit and up your foliar game to be able to put foliar nutrition on so that you can get zinc into that plant, or at least temporarily enough maybe to grow this one crop cycle. It's only, remember this with foliars, particularly when you're using micronutrients, and I think that's the best place to put them because you don't need very much to get a response. But when you do that, you're just fixing that crop cycle. You are not fixing the soil. And if you don't do anything the next time, you will have the same issue. So you always remember it's more of a Band-Aid rather than a long-term fix. Okay? And then another thing is, and this is the case with a lot of things, cold, wet soil. Okay? And these are more functions. When you see things that don't like to get taken up in cold, wet soils, it means if the soils are wet, you've taken most of the air out. If they're cold, there isn't a high production of a lot of microbiology. If they don't have air and they don't have the proper temperature, they're not going to multiply at the rate that's going to make your soil work the way it was intended to. So cold, wet soils happens on a lot of nutrients because that's where the microbiology stalls out at and isn't able to be taken up nearly as well without the presence of good, active microbiology. The other things you'll need to know about zinc are more related to what type of crop am I going to grow. You know, if I'm growing something for the long haul, and that means like I have a perennial crop like a tree crop, then I'm going to work on zinc till I get my numbers of zinc balanced with phosphate or at a level that it's high enough I should be able to get plenty of zinc in there. I'll work on the rest of my soil structure, but I'll also make sure that I always maintain the proper level. And if I begin to see any off color on leaf, I'll probably use a micronutrient blend to put on that leaf surface as a foliar so that it is taken up well. Okay. The thing that we want to know about micronutrients is most of the time when we are looking at micronutrients, they don't need to be very much there, but they are there for extremely important pieces of the growth cycle. One of the things that you will look at when you look at zinc, it's absolutely vital in the life of soil microorganisms, and it needs to be there in place, and we'll talk about it later, with molybdenum, okay? And with that, certain microorganisms, particularly like Acetobacter, which is works with nitrogen-fixing microorganisms. So if you're growing a legume, absolutely essential. It also aids in the promotion of normal growth and tissue respiration for animal life, but also for plant life, because that promotion of normal growth so that you're able to distribute nutrients across the borders from vein to vein in leaves and throughout your fruiting mechanism, your fruit, whether it be a nut crop or a fruit crop or whatever it is, it's to move the nutrients across that so you're filling up throughout so that there aren't any shortages throughout whatever part of that fruit or nut crop you are growing. It also is important and these are more in human and animal, is insulin and vitamin B deficiency. You know, it helps along those lines. You know, sometimes we see things in our diet that aren't correct, and it leads to a lot of human health problems. Well, leads to livestock problems too. And if you looked at the soil as a live organism, okay, you know, Dr. William Albrecht, who I've quoted many times throughout these podcasts, has said is that the soil the microbiology is the stomach of your soil, because it is processing all these nutrients. And when you're short, whether it be vitamins, minerals, or whatever, your stomach doesn't work properly. If you weighed all those microorganisms, they weigh about the amount of a fairly good-sized dairy cow, like 1,500 pounds of microorganisms if you weighed them all out in 1 acre of soil. That's a lot when you figure how really small that they are, and then to think that they weigh 1,500 pounds in combination for every acre of soil that you have out there. It's just a monster number that we have. And we're trying to feed them and feed that stomach, like Dr. Albrecht called it, properly. It's also important in livestock for your hair coat, to give it the sheen, etc. A lot of times when you look at some of the micronutrients, you'll see things that are a little rough and scruffy, particularly on livestock. You can look out at a pen of dairy heifers and all of a sudden see that their hair is kind of scruffy. And a lot of times if you look in their diet, they could be missing zinc or another micronutrient. It's really taken a while, but it's really what's considered now a dietary essential, something that's needed in the diet. And I'm going to look back, if you look back again to what's in your but your multivitamins that we consume sometimes on a daily basis. Look at what's in there, and you'll see there's zinc, and you'll see there's manganese, and you'll see there's a lot of the other micronutrients, because some of our food is void those in their growing process, so they're not there to consume when you consume those micronutrients. So it's, again, essential that we grow them properly to get those amounts. And again, we look at very, very small amounts. That's why they're labeled micronutrients. I go over that point again and again. I think it's more important to call them essential micronutrients, meaning we have to have them, but in very, very small amounts. And some are tiny, tiny amounts that we'll talk about a little later on. Some of the, I almost call them micronutrients. They're smaller than most of the other micronutrients, but again, essential. And essential is a really great word because it says we don't function properly without something that's essential in our life, or in our diet, or in the diet of our plant, or in the diet of the microbes. So as we kind of summarize today on a lot of what I've talked about on zinc, one of the things that I go back to, it's usually fairly easy to talk someone into putting zinc on because they have seen that deficiency before and they recognize it when they see it. But when you see it, you've waited too long because you have already got damage done to this year's crop. And although you may make it look pretty again, it's not going to ever be producing what you wanted it to produce before. A lot of the functions of zinc can be limited by either not having enough, just not having enough parts per million in that soil to be able to be available to the microbiology to mineralize and deliver back to the plant. That's one. Another way could be it is blocked so that microbiology cannot get to these micronutrients to properly get them to the plant. Either way, the plant is now deficient that zinc molecule. That zinc ion that we are looking for, which is double positive, a very strong cation, held tightly to the soil colloids that we talked about in many episodes ago. That soil colloid, it only releases that zinc for the most part when the microbiology basically needs that for its function, and it'll harvest it off of that soil colloid because it needs it. So we need a robust microbiology to be able to take that nutrient, mineralize it off that soil colloid, and be able to consume it and then deliver it back to the plant. Dr. Albrecht said on this and any nutrient, it becomes much more available to the next organism that consumes it. So when you consume something, it is much more available to the next species behind you. A good example is that the microbiology consumes a micronutrient. That micronutrient now is much more available as that microbe dies and allows that to be consumed by the plant or by more microorganisms which ultimately feed that plant for us. So it's very important to understand they become off that soil colloid and to the plant almost exclusively by microbiology. It is important that we keep a strong microbiology to deliver not just micronutrients, but all nutrients to the plant. We will notice zinc deficiency, but usually too late by the form of stunted growth, where we're not getting it to elongate. It's looking yellow. It's looking with these interveinal chlorosis, which looks like a little zebra stripes, with those stripes on the veins followed by yellow pieces between veins, those parts of the leaf that aren't getting enough nutrients, because I like to call zinc the distributor. It's really important to distribute all the other nutrients besides itself. You need to have zinc into that tissue, but it also, as on some of the things I talked about, of making calcium mobile, making uniform maturity, meaning be able to get potassium, everything to cross across all these barriers so that it fills all the leaf surface and not just into the veins and stop. So you see it, but normally it's too late to do much about it. When you see tree crops where they're dying back on the ends, almost always it's because they didn't get enough zinc. Well, when you don't get enough zinc, was it too much phosphate that prevented you from getting enough? Maybe you had good zinc in the tissue, but you didn't have enough overall in this entire plant. And so therefore it dies back on those twigs because it knows it didn't get enough zinc, and it's allowing itself next year to do a better job. There's plenty of soil conditions. I talked about those. That high pH will definitely block zinc uptake, and vice versa. High zinc will block low phosphate uptake, and they're living in a combative state all the time, one being antagonistic to the other. Also, these cold, wet soils, but that's pretty much because we just don't have the biology to be able to get that zinc pulled loose, mineralized, and then delivered to the plant. And so it's all of these things put together that when we look at our micronutrients, we have to get to that issue or that point where we have numbers in the soil that we can count on to be delivered to the plant in the soil, proper soil structure to be able to get air and water so that we get good microbiology to work, to be able to mine and mineralize off of the soil colloid, and then be able to deliver those in the proper volumes and amounts to the plant we're trying to grow. It sounds simple. Obviously, I'm trying to simplify something that is extremely complex. But nonetheless, hopefully you're understanding and getting how and whys of why certain things work and why other times they don't. We'll continue to work on our micronutrients over the next several podcasts. Until then, have a good growing season, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for sharing all about zinc, Bill. I'm sure everyone listening thoroughly enjoyed what you had to say about it. Make sure to stay tuned for more episodes to come, and make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and always stay curious.